Hey there, Matt Allington here, and today I'm going to talk about the recent changes in COVID reporting here in Australia related to active cases. So you may not be aware of what's happened, but what happened on the 10th of September was that the New South Wales government decided to change the way it reported active cases. So you can see here the trend of active cases was increasing every day up to 30,000 active cases, and then all of a sudden it was down to 16,000 active cases. So I'm just going to show you some analysis that I did on this change in data, because I wondered, is this real? Is this not real? Now, what I'm not able to do is tell you whether the active cases are correct or not, but what I can show you is what I found when I analysed the data. So here I have the data. I've got the total new cases per day. I've created this new measure, which I'll talk about in a moment, and then this is the reported active cases per day. And so the big question is, what happened here and was it appropriate? So what I'll do is I'll show you my formula for cumulative cases. Now, the way cumulative cases works is that it's going to take the cases for today and it will create a running total for the cases back in time. So when my active case horizon slicer is set to 1, it will just take 1 day's worth of active cases. If I change that setting to 2, it will take 2 days of cases. So you can see it's currently set at 1 day. If I come up here and change this to 2, you can see now instead of the 2077 appearing here, we're getting 3980, which is these two numbers together. If I change this to 4, this number is orders of magnitude 4 times higher. So now this is these 4 numbers added together. And it's a pretty simple measure. I'm just using a time intelligence function. So here's my cumulative cases. So this measure here determines what value is coming from the slicer. So it's currently 4. And then what it does is it takes the date as it appears here. So this would be, say, the 6th of September. It takes the current date, 6th of September, and then it goes back 4 days, because 4 is in the slicer, and does a running total. Now, the reason I've built this tool is to be able to overlay the data so I can actually see what's going on. So let's now jump onto another report and I'll show you this in action. All right, so here I am on my final report that I settled on, and I've got a combo chart here. So it's a column chart with a line chart over the top. These light blue columns are the total number of cases. So you can see the cases that have been occurring on a daily basis. This is the first wave, second wave, and third wave over here. This dark blue line is on the other axis. So it's orders of magnitude higher in count than it is for total cases. And you can see that there's a similar pattern though, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But that's the reported cases coming from the government. And in fact, it's coming from 2 separate governments, because this phase back here was primarily Victoria. So the active cases would have been reported by Victorian Health. And the wave 3 is primarily, or certainly up until now, it's primarily been a New South Wales phenomenon, and therefore the active cases have been reported by New South Wales Health. All right, so this orange line is my cumulative active cases. So at this point in time, this orange line is actually the same as the blue. The reason it's so much smaller is because it's on a different axis. But look what happens when I start to increase the number here in my horizon. You'll see that that orange line starts to change shape because it's becoming a cumulative total. And so at this point in time, it's giving me all the cases up to and including today for the previous 5 days. So the logic I used here is that once you've been identified as having the virus, then you would be considered to be active for a period of time. Of course, it's not perfect, because sometimes the day you get tested could be day 4 of the virus versus day 3 versus day 6, whatever. But this is the best I can do. And so what I wanted to do initially was to try and work out what was being reported for this blue line. So the objective here was to increase this parameter until I could make the orange line appear about the same as the blue line. So if I come up to 19, you can see I've gone too far, so 17. So 17 is pretty close. I've actually set it on 16 as being the correct number. So what this says to me is for wave 2, which was predominantly a Victorian wave, the government appeared to be using a time horizon of about 16 days after someone was reported having COVID or tested positive for COVID as to being considered as being active, and then about at the end of that period of time, the case was no longer considered to be active. Now, the interesting thing here is when you look over on the third wave, notice how this dark blue line is not that closely aligned to this orange line. And in fact, if I just put a filter on the third wave, you'll be able to see that there's actually quite a bit of divergence between these lines. And so the second thing I wanted to do is say, well, what if I was to try and, instead of mapping this one over here, I'll try and map this one here. So as I increase these numbers, in fact, I'll go back to the third wave only. As I increase these numbers here, notice that there's actually quite a difference. And so, but if I keep cranking this number up, and of course I could overshoot if I got to 30, it's too far, but in my analysis, it looks like about 27 days appears to be the right number. So when I take the total new reported active cases and I include everything up until today's date, going back 27 days, it appears that that number reasonably closely aligns to the active cases reported by New South Wales Health. But this number, 27 days, is clearly significantly different to what was happening when we looked at the second wave back in Victoria last year. And if I switch over here, you can see that there's nowhere near a good fit between the 27-day horizon and what was being reported. And so the third thing that I then did was to say, well, what if I was to now try and align this orange line with this point here? So this is the new point that's been provided to us by New South Wales Health. This is where they're saying it's at the moment. So what would I have to do to this orange line to make it line up with this new line? So if I drop this back, say, to the 16 that I had for Melbourne last year, you'll see that that's actually too far. And if I come back even more, I've come up with a conclusion that about 11 days is the correct number. As I said, I can't tell you whether this is correct or not. What I can say is that it would appear that 16 days after being tested positive in wave 2 last year appeared to be the number that was being used for active cases, give or take, given the difference in the timing of the start of the infection versus the date that you were tested. Of course, there's a bit of a lag there. But you can see from this analysis that certainly what's being used now, being 11 days, is different to what was being used in Melbourne last year, which was 16 days, and it's certainly different to what was being used in New South Wales up until 3 or 4 days ago, which was 27 days. So I don't know what the right answer is, but that's what the data say.